If the first panelist could come up to the stage, that would be great. And that first piece with Eleanor Roosevelt was actually thank you to Henry Morgenthau. It was one of the programs that he produced for WGBH. Our first panel is about the origins of public broadcasting, and our moderator will be Cokie Roberts. Cokie Roberts is a political commentator.
Don't do all that.
Oh, please, I have it all written out. I'm dying to at least say she was cited by American women in radio and television as one of the 50th greatest women in the history of broadcasting. And in 2008, the Library of Congress named her a living legend, which we totally agree with.
Living.
So. Cokie.
Well, I am thrilled to be moderating this panel because this is one of the rare times in my life that I'm the kid.
Thanks.
I joined NPR 10 years after the Public Broadcasting Act was signed, so I've been there 40 years. And these gents preceded me. Nick Johnson was at the FCC and a troublemaker all the time, and then did PBS programs as well as columns, but was very involved with public broadcasting after he left the FCC. So, Nick, what was the role of the FCC in all of this?
Well, I would like to go back a little further.
Okay.
Since I believe Mr. Morgenthau and I are amongst the more age of experience, yeah. And so
the wise men.
What?
The wise men.
Well, not necessarily, as we often see, but no. But to go back to the 18th century, because. There are other presidents involved in this besides Lyndon Johnson, with regard to whom I might add an anecdote that he brought me in February of '64, and shortly thereafter, a memo went out to all presidential appointees, you may recall this, saying, I want you to tell me what you think would be in the best interests of our nation with the area for which you have responsibility. And in my case, at that time, it was ports and shipbuilding and shipping. He made me maritime administrator, just exactly what you would think a boy from Iowa with...
The coast of Iowa.
The coast of Iowa, with shipping experience limited to operating a canoe on the Iowa River, but not very successfully. Something that thankfully the Commerce Committee found fully adequate to justify the appointment. But I think that's another thing to say about Lyndon Johnson, that compared with other presidents perhaps who will go unnamed, that there would actually be that focus on what's in the best national interest. But I want to go back to Madison, who I just learned today is referred to by those who work at the Library of Congress as Jimmy Madison.
Yes, he was Jimmy.
What?
He was Jimmy. Spelled J-E-M-M-Y.
Is that right? Wasn't James Madison?
Jimmy. Was.
I'll be darned. What, did your father tell you that?
No, I write history books.
He was a great. They would be so proud of you now and everything you've done. No, I'm serious. Hale and Lindy Boggs, great people. Well, anyhow, I want to go back to Jimmy Madison, however you spell his name. And there's an inscription as you came into this building you may have noticed. And I'm going to link this up with Thomas Jefferson and then ultimately with public broadcasting and try to do it in 5 minutes or less, if that's all right?
All right.
Yeah, less would be better, less is more, yeah. And it contains this line, a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. That's Madison's quote. Jefferson, and many of you may know this, but when writing his own epitaph, chose to be remembered as the father of the University of Virginia and made no mention of the fact that he'd been president of the United States. Now this is very significant, I think, because what these folks were doing was recognizing and establishing and making efforts to maintain fundamental pillars of democracy, many of which have always been and continue to be today under attack. One, obviously, is extending the franchise from originally white male landowners over 21 to where now we even let women vote.
Took a while.
It did take a long while, and 18-year-olds. But then the addition of free public education, a fundamental element and pillar of democracy. And then the idea of independent media, protected by the First Amendment. For Jefferson also said, as famously, as you all know, in writing Edward Carrington, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." And then went on in the next sentence to say, "But I should mean that every person should receive those papers and be capable of reading them," again tying it to education. Subsequently, we added the idea of free public libraries, where every American could have access to the resources of kings. And indeed, this library was contributed to by Jefferson in 1815, as you probably know. Something that is often not thought about in this context, but relates to what John Gardner did. Incidentally, he wrote two wonderful books. We wrote a lot of stuff, but that are paperback books, one called Excellence, one called Self-Renewal, which I think are always worth rereading at least every 20 or 30 years. Because the other thing we did was to establish reduced rates for sending newspapers and books and magazines through the postal system, subsidizing what was at that time the communications network of the 19th century, was the post office. And then we added telegraph and telephone and so on. But that was how it began. And as all of you know, the early time of radio, and I want to tell just one story about Iowa City and then I'm done. Is that okay? Yeah, all right. The early days of radio involved numerous, 72 in the very early days, educational institutions that did not only the technological work of creating this box in which little people lived and could talk, but also the programming and the focus on the use of this as an instrument of education. In Iowa City, Iowa, from whence I come, a city designated by the United Nations as one of 3 global cities of literature, was created the first educational radio station west of the Mississippi. That was in 1911, all right? So this goes back before 1967 for those who are younger among us here today. In 1971, WSUI became a charter member of NPR, one of the early few, and one of the 90 stations to carry the inaugural broadcast of Bill's All Things Considered. In 1916, it began transmitting educational content, ultimately including my father's lectures in the 1940s. By the late 1920s, remember this, 1920s, they had educational television broadcasting television images of classroom content. A station that would ultimately be one of the founding stations creating Iowa Public Television, and thus endeth the reading for today.